of enlightened women, known as New. New educates, equips, and empowers young women leaders for a free society. A key aspect of New is that we create a vibrant community in person and right now more online. And as we begin this discussion, please feel free to leave questions in the comments and we'll answer them at the end. So I am pleased to have here with us today Shoshana Weissmann. She manages R Street Institute's social media and email marketing and has written for various publications, including the Wall Street Journal and USA Today. She also has a very active social media presence, so you should check her out if you are not also already following her. So thank you for joining us, Shoshana.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yes. Well, I am eager to talk with you today about occupational licensing, because who knew, but coronavirus is raising lots of questions in this area and showing how much room for reform there is. So under traditional state licensing regimes, individual states require people to make certain specific requirements in order to get a license to practice an occupation. So trying to work across a state line requires a new license. Occupational licensing is increasingly common. Today, it covers nearly 30% of the U.S. workforce, up from 5% in the 1950s. Can you tell us, why do we have occupational licensing, and tell us a little bit more about what states are doing in this regard?
Sure. So all over you have all kinds of licenses, especially for lower income ones. They're not constant across state lines. So like Louisiana is the only state that licenses florists, like people who arrange flowers. Then cosmetology licenses are pretty common. Whether you're painting nails, cutting hair, dyeing hair, even blow drying hair requires a license in all but 2 states.
So you have 48 states, you have to have a license to blow dry hair?
Yes.
Wow.
It's really ridiculous.
Why is that? What's the concern?
So everyone says health or safety. Every industry will say, oh, we have to do this to protect people, but there's never evidence, like ever. And even with salons, there's evidence that that people do get health infections and, nail infections, foot infections from salons, but licensing isn't solving it. So for me, I always try to think about the best means ends fit. And I never blame people for trying a new regulatory regime that might work better. But the problem is you can't undo it easily. It's a lot easier to put in regulations than it is to take them out, which is why you have the florist license staying, or some localities license fortune tellers. It varies so much across state lines. And in every case, you pretty much get these either because politicians were encouraged to do something, even if it's not something well thought through, or because because industries lobby for more protections, and not protections for people, but protections so that other people can't do the work they're doing. And it'll be illegal to do that work without a license, so their income is protected. Some people even defend that in itself on its merits, but I think that's pretty wrong, because you stop people from being able to do what they want to do without harming people. And evidence really, in rare cases, matches up. You'll always get people saying, well, what evidence is it that it's safe to do whatever without a license? But there's no evidence saying it isn't safe. And I don't think people should have to prove negatives to get their liberty back.
Interesting. So what are some occupational licensing laws that you think are the craziest that are on the books right now?
Oh man, fortune telling is really up there. I can even understand government wanting to protect people from scams, but saying this is a government approved fortune teller is pretty silly. Florists are ridiculous. There's no evidence that it causes harm in the other 49 states where you don't have a license to be a florist. Even painting nails, that's pretty ridiculous. Blow drying hair, braiding hair, that's been a big deregulatory effort because it's just ridiculous. Like, you shouldn't need a license to braid hair. There's so many. In a lot of states, you need a license to give even basic diet advice in exchange for money. And I'm not talking about like even advanced stuff, just like, hey, maybe have more protein. That's illegal in a lot of states, and it ends up harming people. the one case for that I always go back to is in Florida. They recently changed the law, so it's better, but you needed a license, or basically there's a military spouse who moved from California where she started her business. She did great. She moved to Florida with her military spouse because military spouses just have to constantly move for active duty. And she was giving diet advice while doing her fitness training, and they did a sting operation on her, on a military spouse, for like just helping people eat healthy. It's ridiculous. And she was forced to stop. The Institute for Justice defended her, and she had to go through the whole court process. And it was just ridiculous that we treat people like this. In other cases, in Arizona, there was a guy cutting hair for the homeless, and the cosmetology board cracked down on him. He was even a cosmetology student, but they said, "Oh, you don't have a license. It's dangerous to cut hair for the homeless." Governor Ducey
Is he doing this for free?
Yeah, for free. And in my opinion, I don't think money should change the equation, but it's somehow just more ridiculous when they're not even charging, and the boards are cracking down on them. And it's frustrating because Governor Ducey had to step in to protect him in Arizona. But if he didn't, that guy wouldn't have been able to get his cosmetology license. The board was really looking to stop him from making career progress because of that. You see these cases all over, and they're so hard to document because not everyone feels like going public. Some people just want to back off and live their lives, which is understandable.
So in light of coronavirus, what reforms are we seeing happen, specifically with the medical community?
So it's funny because whenever you talk about medical licensing reform, people are like, "Oh, you libertarians don't want doctors to have licenses." But this isn't about that. There's a lot of really modest reforms you can have. For example, medical professionals practicing across state lines, and there have been a ton of executive orders to allow that. Right now, only Pennsylvania and Arizona allow people, new residents, to transfer their licenses fairly easily, and that just happened last year. Those laws are really important. We need more of them because they can be expedited in times of crisis. It's better to have some model than no model at these times. Even expanding nurse scope of practice, allowing them to do everything they're qualified to do and not making them practice under a doctor, because that just ends up reducing access to care. And states realize that you have to get rid of these restrictions in order to expand access, especially at a time like this. There's also been a lot of telemedicine reform, just allowing people to. It's funny because it ends up being a state line issue, even though it's a virtual thing. So a lot of states are saying, wherever you're located, you can practice telemedicine in our state. And I think
that's interesting. So
yeah,
even though you wouldn't go to another state, the fact that you live in a different one would traditionally prohibit you from doing telemedicine.
It depends on the state and the law, and it's so frustrating because it varies everywhere, but generally it depends where the telemedicine platform itself is based on whether you're licensed there, whether the doctor is licensed in the state the patient's in. Those are two kind of the ways that are determined depending on the state. And thankfully, those restrictions have been quickly waived, and they need to be because people need access to care. They shouldn't be leaving their homes unless absolutely necessary. So that's a really big help. And we've been advocating for this for years, and other people have been advocating for this far longer than I have. But honestly, since before I was born in a lot of cases for these reforms. But it's exciting to see them happen now that that regulators aren't getting in the way of progress, especially at such a vital time. But I would say the wildest one I've seen, which I'm really excited about, is allowing foreign doctors to practice in New York and New Jersey. I don't think it's been other states yet, but it's hard to keep track of all the executive orders because I've seen like over 100, and remembering all of them gets hard. But last I heard, it was New York and New Jersey are allowing foreign doctors to practice, which is incredible. For years, there's been a fight to allow that. And there are certain international rules we have to be careful about just because we don't want to take doctors from other places that might need it more, generally like third world countries. But, you have doctors in the US, I've met them, who are janitors, who work for Uber, and those jobs are great. But if you've gone through all that training and can't use it to help people, that's a huge problem. So for those states to waive those requirements is unreal. It's been a long fight. And the process, it's really long and complicated. Like foreign doctors have to compete for residency spots with medical school graduates, and there's not even enough residency spots to begin with, which is this whole other problem. And that's why we don't have enough doctors in part. But these reforms have been things that people have been trying to make the case for years, saying this is going to expand access to care. We can't let some mythical perfect that just can't exist under our current laws become the enemy of real good, real help. And I'm glad they haven't let it happen now, but I'm hoping some of these reforms stay. These executive orders are limited, so this will all need to go through the legislature, but I'm hoping this creates momentum after this is all over to reform these laws so that during future pandemics, natural disasters, whether it's a hurricane, a flood, or some virus again, that we won't be in as bad a position. It's been really hard.
Let's not think of another virus. Right
Yeah.
But I thought it was so interesting in New York when there was really a call that went out for doctors and nurses, and you saw the need there.
Yeah.
This I wonder how many people. Do we have any numbers on how many people then took advantage of these reforms to occupational licensing laws in New York?
I haven't seen the numbers yet, and it's a known issue with a lot of regulatory boards that they're just bad at producing numbers. I mean, that's why a lot of licensing reformers struggle to get rates of harm because they don't publish them, and sometimes they don't even collect them. And that's during like a normal time. So I have a feeling it's going to be a while, but I hope we do see the numbers so we can see just how helpful this is going to be. And I'm hoping that applies to everything we've been talking about. Like, let's say, for example, nurses weren't more effective when they were giving more autonomy. We should know that. Although all data to date shows it's the opposite way, that the more you give nurses and pharmacists the ability to help people, the more it helps people. But with foreign doctors, I'm hoping that we maybe get some more data so maybe we can reduce restrictions on them. And I'm not saying throw out the baby with the bathwater, but there's a lot of bathwater.
Yeah. And do you think some of these reforms will stay after coronavirus, or what's your expectation of what happens next?
I definitely think some of them will. I don't know how many. It's hard to say because the lobbies are so strong. I mean, the American Medical Association is always fighting with the Nurses Association because doctors want more money and don't want nurses to be able to do more. And they know the evidence. It's just even real health or safety concerns can be mixed with economic protectionism, which is really frustrating. But I do think you're going to see
it's a competition issue in some of these cases. Is that what you're?
Yeah.
Saying that it's definitely a barrier that
right.
that can be used.
It's not a protection, but a barrier. Exactly. And it's frustrating, but I'm hoping that with all the new evidence created showing how this has all helped and how badly it was needed, that a lot of these restrictions will be lifted, that regulations will be written smarter. And, I don't think it's going to be perfect across the board, but I think you're going to see some reforms. And I'm hoping that when those reforms continue to prove good, that other states will follow suit. But it's going to take a lot of legislative work because these executive orders, should be limited, because even if we like what they're doing now, we might not like, the stroke of the pen down the line.
That is a very good point. And now the last thing I wanted to ask you was about Arizona. You and I have both written about some of the reforms in Arizona. Could you talk about what they've done in the last 12 to 18 months?
So Governor Ducey is the greatest. He works really well with everyone there, and I'm so proud to have him as a friend. He's just a wonderful person generally, but he was the one who signed into law the first law allowing new residents to easily transfer in their licenses. It's not perfect, and there's still some work to do, but it's a really, really good model, and we should be building upon that. He also helped get rid of the hair blow drying license. That took a while to happen. And he gets why regulatory reform matters. He's not just a guy who's doing whatever. He wants to know what's going to help the state. During the crisis, I was wondering what he would do because he's already done so much. And I look and I see he has an executive order that's like telemedicine for dogs. He's really looking at every possible angle to make people's lives easier. He's allowing restaurants to sell groceries, unlike in Los Angeles County, where they were providing a barrier to that, which is silly when people need groceries. But Governor Ducey is really passionate about this. He's trying to implement more accountability. And I think you're just going to see lots more from Arizona, at least while he's in charge.
Well, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I now want to turn to a few audience questions that we've had come in. So I'm getting them emailed to me. So one came in that asked, what can we as young women do to advocate for occupational licensing reform?
Talk to your state legislators. Most people just yell at politicians, but if you find an interest from the politician and align it, that's one way to go about it. Like if they really care about military people and making sure that our military is taken care of, then these laws allowing military spouses to practice across state lines, they might have an interest there and show that. If you know a politician is just really out there for poor people, licensing really hurts poor people, and there's lots of papers about that all over. In part because it stops people from moving up the next step of the ladder, and also it increases prices on services, so people can't afford those services. So whatever their interest is, see what angle there is to advocate for policies, whether this or others that you care about, because politicians always need ideas, and in state legislatures they don't always have the resources. And if you're a constituent, or even if you just live in the state rather than the specific district, they'll probably want to hear from you. And this goes for others too, but especially with state legislators.
And what have you found, to follow up to this, what have you found have been the most compelling arguments for state legislatures when you've talked to them or have written about this issue? What seems to work to motivate these state legislators to take action on reform?
It's showing them the numbers with the stories. The policies I believe in because the data shows that they harm people, but there's nothing wrong with illustrating the data with anecdotes, as long as the anecdotes aren't your anecdata. But when people really see a guy cutting hair for the homeless is cracked down on, or you can't even do the most basic things without a license, and some things are licensed in some places and not others, and there's no difference in harm, but there is often a difference in number of providers. I keep forgetting which states it is, but there's two bordering southern states. One licenses hair braiders and the other doesn't. The one that doesn't has tons of hair braiders in the state. The other has very few. And you can tell it's not because there aren't people willing, but this law is just stopping some economic activity. So when you can give politicians the evidence and show them that there needs to be reforms, show how it's helped other states, and also just appeal to whatever the politician in particular cares about, and also show the stories, like the hair braider who was cracked down on, or the florist who was cracked down on. I think we can all look at that and say that's ridiculous, and also make it less partisan. I work with the Republicans and Democrats, and I'm happy to. Whoever wants to do the stuff, I'm here for. But I think when you avoid making it partisan, then you expand the opportunity for these reforms to turn into action.
That's a great point, that this really reforming occupational licensing really is an empowering policy agenda, and one that doesn't need to be partisan. That politicians on both sides of the aisle can make compelling arguments for reform. I got another question from one of our students who we had sent an article that you had contributed to recently about potential reform in this area in light of coronavirus, both short term and long term. Could you talk about, we've talked about what has happened. What else would you like to see happen?
Oh man, there's so much. I mean, I want all this to happen broadly. I want every state that hasn't done it yet to allow people to work across state lines, expand their scope of practice. So basically everything I'd mentioned that hasn't already been done in a state should be. There's also a lot of things that are tangential to licensing, like home-based businesses aren't allowed in a lot of states. Basically, you might think, oh, you might not want a million cars on your street all the time. But I'm talking about someone working from home doing what I'm doing right now, which is talking into my laptop. One locality in Georgia banned that. There have been other states that have done similar kinds of things. And it's all localities rather than states, but those laws need to be suspended and removed. Those never help anyone, ever. And especially now when we're telling people to stay at home, we shouldn't be punishing them for doing so. Also, AB 5 needs to go. That's just awful in California. A lot of people were happily working from home, and it cut their work because they were free.
Explain what that is to our audience.
Sure. So AB 5 basically stopped freelancers from being able to be freelancers in many cases. Not all cases. There were certain limits on it and certain exemptions, but it applied broadly, and especially to freelance copywriters and editors. And you hear these stories of people who worked from home because they were sick or their family was sick, or other things just made it easier for them to work from home and have a flexible schedule. They all lost their work in January or February, and now they're at home without work and without the ability to seek work.
What was California's justification for this?
They're saying it helps freelancers because they really want to be employees, even though many of them didn't want to be employees. And there's certain qualifications where it's understandable. If they're having you on a constant schedule, then maybe they should be paying you like an employee. But these were people who could work whenever, as much as they want, as little as they want. They were honest freelancers, like really what it means to be a freelancer. And the law just stopped them from being able to work, which was horrific. A lot of these people also got mental health issues because of it, because they lost their livelihood overnight. I just couldn't imagine what they're going through now. And a lot of states have been seeking to emulate this law, and they definitely should not. And California really needs to suspend it. And also basically whether it's giving diet advice or anything that can be done virtually, those need to be waived. That's ridiculous that you can't give diet advice without a license, especially while people are staying home and studies are showing more people are gaining weight than losing weight during this time, which is understandable. But we shouldn't put barriers to people being healthy ever, and especially now. There's so much more that can be done, but that's just kind of a top line.
Yeah, thank you. A lot of good ideas to think about for our audience. So thanks for raising those. The last question that I've received is on the role of the federal government. So we've talked a lot about states and what states are doing. What would you like to see the federal government do?
So CMS, Center for Medicaid Services, has been really good with enabling states to enact these reforms, because sometimes states can't do these reforms because there's federal laws saying that if you reform this, you won't get this money or something. It's really complicated. I don't fully understand it because it's just this huge regulatory thicket. But just continuing to do that, to allow states to do what they need, is something really big. Definitely allowing more testing and opening up medical reforms. Right to Try that passed a couple of years ago was fantastic, allowing for more experimental medicine. We need to do lots more of that, just allowing people to try stuff. I don't mind the idea of more mandatory disclosure with that stuff, even though there's evidence that mandatory disclosure doesn't work. It's a long story. But basically, we need to get government out of the way of progress, whether state or federal. And there's a bill right now from, Representative Bishop in North Carolina, because his state waived their CON laws. CON is aptly named, but it stands for Certificate of Need. It basically means that if you want to do something new, like start a new business, you have to get approval from your competitors. It's insane. And it often applies to healthcare, adding hospital beds, adding new medical facilities. And it's been really, really pernicious in North Carolina. They waived their CON laws after years of saying, oh, well, we need this to keep prices low and help people. But I guess that was a lie. They waived it pretty fast, too. It was like, oh, well, we need help, so we're going to waive these laws. But the bill from the congressman would prevent them from being punished for doing so, because I think there was like a bill, there was legislation in the 70s that encouraged states to add certificate of need laws, because government never knows what it's doing, so they can be penalized for waiving them. This law would prevent them from being penalized. So more stuff like that, just stopping harm being done to states for doing the right thing in whatever way. And also just allowing more testing and more medical innovation. I think that's kind of where the federal government, as far as regulatory reforms, can play the best role right now.
Yeah, we've seen some changes made as we're trying to get these tests moving more quickly, right?
Yeah.
FDA.
And it's been nice to see that, but they were way too late. I mean, through all of February, they were still in the way. So we could have been in a much better position had they stepped out of the way far earlier. I know that the FDA genuinely has the best interest of people in mind. Not all the time, but a lot of times. And I think even here they did, but they just should have stepped out of the way a lot sooner. And it's hard to see more people suffering because they didn't,
Yeah. So as we wrap up, thank you for being with us today. We really appreciate it. Could you tell people where they can find you on social media? I'd love to have our viewers follow you.
Sure. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me. On Twitter, I'm at Senator Shoshana. I swear a lot, be forewarned. It's all swearing, SpongeBob, and talking about regulatory reform. And all my work and my colleagues is at rstraight.org.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Shoshana.
Thanks so much for having me.
Bye.
Bye.